I'll start us off with the what we're hoping to talk about today, and hoping to get some good questions from you all on unlocking international finance to promote agricultural resilience and support smallholder farmers. Bill, I can pass it over to you to introduce yourself.
Thank you, Janet. Well, it's a pleasure to talk with you today. I'm Bill Salas, the Chief Strategy Officer at Regrow Agriculture. My background is I'm a scientist. I originally worked at NASA on remote sensing science, and then as an academic working on how we track agricultural production and greenhouse gas emissions from global agricultural production systems. We'll talk a little bit about some technologies today, but I'm going to pass it back to Janet to introduce herself and then sort of set the stage for what is needed to unlock climate finance to both benefit smallholder productions, create a more resilient production system, but also creating the climate benefits that the global stakeholders are seeking. So we look forward to having a conversation with you today. It's a small group, so we can keep this very informal. Please ask questions at any point in time. And we look forward to the discussion. So back to you, Janet.
Great. Yes, sounds good. And I think it is recorded. So if there's others who are hoping to watch it at other times, I know there's lots of competing sessions. So, hopefully the recording can be shared also. So I'm Janet Smith. I manage strategic partnerships at Regrow, work very closely with Bill on our public-private partnerships and working to make sure that the data and the tools that Regrow produces and creates are both getting into the hands of folks who are out there doing great work on the ground, supporting farmers directly, and also is helping to inform things like policy and drive positive change. My longer term background, I started out my career working in international development, both on agriculture and health projects in West Africa. So excited to be thinking about and talking about smallholder farmers here. And with that, I'll just give you a layout of kind of how we're planning on organizing this session. First, just giving a broad overview of what the current state of climate financing is today. Then we'll talk about MRV and focus on Regrow's MRV and how it can help unlock some of this financing, and then give you some project examples on some work that we've done in the public-private partnership space. So as we said, as Bill said, feel free to ask any questions in the chat anytime. We want to keep this very informal, even though we unfortunately cannot see all of you. But look forward to hopefully getting some questions and some dialogue and talking with you after. So I assume that a lot of the folks who are listening in know a lot of this piece on the kind of current state of climate financing, but I think it's really important to kind of set the stage here and really, explain and talk about the cycle and the feedback that's currently happening in the agri-food system activities and climate, and how, as of right now, there is this, vicious cycle that's occurring where as the demand for food and for agri-food activities is increasing, it is negatively also increasing GHG emissions, which is of course causing more global heating and climate activities that is then also having a negative impact on the agri-food activities themselves. So there is this kind of negative vicious cycle that really needs investment to ensure some mitigation and adaptation to both the climate, but then also to really change the cycle where there is the possibility of these activities actually having a positive impact and decreasing the emissions themselves. So this is an image actually from a recent World Bank report that's called Recipes for, I believe, a Livable Climate, something like that. It just came out very recently, and so highly recommend checking that out. But I thought that this is a really powerful graphic here that is showing and demonstrating how these emissions are actually even higher than previously expected in the agri-food system space. What we're really focusing on here is these farm gate activities, and that is, about 45% of those emissions of the entire agri-food system space. And so you can see, this is a large problem that, is going to only, get worse if there isn't, action that's being done. Because as we know, the population is growing, demand for food is increasing. How are we going to make sure that there is enough, food that can feed the planet in the future? There's estimates. I've seen lots of different ones, somewhere between 70 billion, somewhere between over 100 billion in annual investments that's needed to meet this demand. And you can see where right now within the broader total climate financing space, agri-food systems is a very small little piece of that. There's only about 14 billion going towards financing right now. So there's clearly a large need, and I think a big question is, why is this financing not happening? What's the barriers towards it? Even though we know that this is actually a big untapped potential and source for this, low cost climate change action. There's somewhere, estimates showing that investments in this space could actually have a 16-to-1 return on investment. So there can be, a large amount of return on investment from, investing in the agri-food system. This could be as much as 4.3 trillion by 2023. So some of the barriers are really around a lot of perceived risk that is seen in investing in agriculture. It's seen and as a very risky space, and currently the kind of general sense is that this is very tricky. It's difficult. There's lots of discouragement of private investment in the sector, and there's this sense of a lack of tools and technology to help, facilitate and understand, what's the outcomes of these investments. So the, general kind of sense is that what's needed to help overcome a lot of these barriers is, better tools and data and technologies that is invested on from both the private sector side as well as the public sector. So these blended kind of finance mechanisms can help alleviate and fill this climate financing gap. So, why should the private sector care in this? I'm sure, lots of you and have seen that, companies are coming out and saying, oh, we're pledging to be net zero by 2050, we're reducing our emissions X amount by 2030. This is an older graphic, but I thought it was pretty cool and powerful. It's from Visual Capitalist. Recommend checking out that website. And this shows 42 different Fortune 500 companies in the US, only in the US, that are ones that have pledged to be carbon neutral. There's lots all over the world, and they need to figure out how to get there. And so this means that as they are setting these emissions reduction targets, they're willing to pay farmers for the carbon that they're sequestering when they're implementing these climate smart practices. So this kind of brings us to the carbon market, where this is a space that can help both these corporations that need to meet their targets and that, want to reduce their emissions, can also help the farmers who, would need that financial investment and have some barriers towards implementing and adopting these climate smart practices. So this is a kind of mutually beneficial market and space for both of these groups. However, why haven't smallholder farmers globally and broadly been able to access the carbon market? Well, for there's a few reasons. We could probably talk about this for many hours, but just some very high level kind of observations as to some of the big barriers and challenges is firstly, the protocols that are around this carbon market space are incredibly complicated and very, very data intensive. And this is, of course, this is needed to make sure that these claims are, reliable and verifiable. But it also means that it can make things, really, really difficult to access and to set up these programs. So with that, it can also, be very, very expensive to run these programs. And there is this high level of kind of transaction costs, whereby the cost of running a program can be even more than a producer would even get from the carbon that they're sequestering and from the price of the carbon that's been set by the market. So those are some two key barriers, along with a lack of ground truth data that can help be able to set up a lot of these programs and be able to actually verify the carbon outcomes themselves. And then lastly, this lack of investment and demand. So seeing this as, especially with smallholder farmers, being really complicated and tricky and hard to drive this investment, it means that there's kind of like we're not even going to try in some ways, And so we hope in the next session to kind of talk through how we might be able to and how Regrow has been able to overcome a lot of these barriers and challenges. But I think it's important to kind of lay out what the current challenges are. So this brings us to MRV and how an MRV platform can help set up these programs and why it's needed. I don't know if anyone here already knows what an MRV is. It means measuring, reporting, and verification. This is a tool and a process that is really needed to ensure and verify that these reductions by companies that they're claiming have actually occurred. So it is, a way of trying to, make sure that greenwashing isn't happening, that companies aren't just saying that they're reducing their emissions, but they don't have these, verifiable actual, outcomes that they've been implementing. And this process, an MRV process, to help really, verifiably measure the amount of emissions that can then be reported to an accredited third party. So, with that, all of that said, MRVs can also be incredibly, expensive and difficult to manage. And so, Regrow has a specific, process and type of MRV that hopefully has kind of surmounted some of these barriers to help support producers globally. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Bill.
Thank you, Jenna. Do we want to entertain, if there are any questions, please insert them in the chat as we move forward. So Jenna did a great job of teeing up, the issue that we're trying to address that we think is critical for enabling smallholder agriculture to participate in climate finance. because, global agricultural production systems, the vast majority of food is produced in fairly small producer systems. So we need to engage with that community if we are going to achieve both the simultaneous objectives of reducing the climate impact of agriculture, so through mitigating greenhouse gas emissions or removal of atmospheric CO2 through soil carbon sequestration, but also in parallel adapting those systems to better deal with weather variability under a climate change future. So it's key that technologies are there to help engage in this process. And so I'll talk a little bit about some of our technologies, but it's meant to sort of highlight advances in remote sensing science, machine learning and artificial intelligence, and soil biogeochemical modeling, how those advances in technology in a scalable software infrastructure can help support investments to unlock climate finance, to help agriculture be a combination of the solution to climate change, but also better adaptation so we can meet the growing needs of food security globally. So if we go to the next slide, just at a very high level, Jen and I both work for Regrow. We are a mission-based company. So everyone who works with us is like, we're in this to help figure out how we can support global agriculture in this journey to deal with climate change and food security. We're a global company, around 180 experts. We have a combination of scientists, software engineers, and others to really achieve our mission of transforming science, complex science, in a way that can help companies and the full agricultural supply chain on their journey to a climate resilient and climate smart production systems. So our goal is to achieve the outcome. We're the independent third party in this whole process. And we think that's very important for transparency and avoidance of potential conflicts of interest. So the goal is scale science and technology in a software infrastructure that enables emissions to be reduced at the farm level, ranging from smallholder production systems to larger, more industrial production systems, but also in parallel enhance agricultural resilience. Because climate change is happening, we need to both protect food security and enhance it in the future. If we go to the next slide, we'll step through sort of all the technologies that are required to create an MRV platform to create the outcomes that we think will unlock climate finance. So agriculture's complex, disparate. Every field is different. Every farmer grows their systems slightly differently. So there's a huge demand for data for agriculture. And there's multiple sources of data that we can rely on to pull together data, ranging from farmer provided data, satellite monitoring that can give us detailed information and insights at the field scale, to geospatial data sets that are produced by public agencies, to drones data, to just general survey data information. So the first step is we need to be able to collect detailed data that's site-specific, field-specific, and farmer-specific. Then we can utilize satellites to monitor the landscape. So if we go to the next component, with advances in operational satellites, we can actually do a pretty good job of mapping every field globally. Right? Currently, we're monitoring about 1.3 billion acres, or 10% of the arable lands globally. We continue to expand that. But with new technologies in terms of satellite technologies, machine learning algorithms, we can reliably map individual fields. So what's the field boundary of a field where a farmer's implementing his production systems? What crops are being grown there? Information on how those crops are growing, when they're planted, when they're harvested, what are the conservation practices that farmer may or may not be implementing in terms of soil disturbance and tillage, or rotations, or cover crop. So with synoptic remote sensing, we can do a pretty good job of actually monitoring large landscapes and reduce the data burdens to collect data at scale. We go to the next part of the slide, then that information feeds into a set of very advanced scientific tools and models that are bespoke to looking at the outcomes we're interested in. So how do we understand how agricultural management practices influence greenhouse gas outcomes at the field scale, given the variability of fields, variability in weather, variability in agronomic practices? So we'll talk a little bit about some tools that can do that. We also want to understand the impact on those agronomic practices on yield resilience. So we also have other tools to looking at how different varieties and cultivars are resilient to the local production practices and environmental conditions, and how changes in greenhouse gas emissions might affect that resilience in the future. Lastly, to also unlock additional corporate finance, many of the corporate actors that Janet sort of highlighted earlier also have water commitments. In addition to carbon and greenhouse gas, they have water commitments, quantity and quality. They have commitments on biodiversity. So how can we unlock that commitment to bring their support to support smallholder production systems? Lastly, at the outcome of this sort of MRV platform is a set of reporting tools that enable both the corporates to understand what's happening, the actors on the ground in terms of what are the impacts of those practice changes, and then following the same protocols that they can get actually ways of monetizing the benefits through various market opportunities, whether they be offsets for carbon, insets for carbon, water quality, quantity markets. So this is sort of the whole outline of how MRV platforms can support smallholder production at scale. If we go to the next slide, highlight a little bit about some of the remote sensing tools. So with continued investment in launching of new satellites from both public and private sector actors in Earth observation space, we now have a plethora of data available for monitoring every field globally every day. So we're able to take that data set and actually create actionable information about production systems. What's being grown where? How well is it growing this season? How are the practices that influence carbon and greenhouse gas cycling? How we can monitor individual fields that are part of market programs, understanding their field boundary, understand how they manage those fields historically. And then also as we move into maybe smallholder production systems that are focused on rice, for example, we can, from space, monitor flooding dynamics, because flooding dynamics is critical for crop production, but also critical for understanding water use and greenhouse gas emissions. And then lastly, there's a move afoot to have longer rotations, introducing things like cover crops. So we protect the soil by having living roots in the soil as long as possible. With satellite monitoring, we can detect the cover crops, and actually more than detect the cover crops, monitor how well they're growing. So a critical set of data sets. These data, as I mentioned previously, feed into models that take that information and quantify environmental outcomes. We feel pretty strongly that probably the most scalable approach is to use mechanistic models that are based on first principles that are applicable in any geography globally. So we think that the quantification should be done through mechanistic models. These models have been in the scientific realm for decades, well peer-reviewed, so we understand that the science is fairly mature. And so we were able to take these scientific tools and put them in a software infrastructure that enables us to scale and validate the tools globally. The types of outcomes that we're monitoring are environmental outcomes like soil carbon dynamics, soil carbon removals, greenhouse gas emissions, including nitrous oxide and methane emissions, releases of reactive nitrogen, which affects local air quality, local water quality, feedback on management with crop yields, and then also soil loss and sediment loss, which impacts both fertility and resilience of the cropping systems, as well as environmental outcomes in terms of water quality and biodiversity loss. So these are sort of key pieces: the remote sensing for collecting synoptic data, detailed mechanistic models for taking that information and transforming it into outcomes of interest to the market to help unlock climate finance. If we go to the next slide, all of that information And tools needs to be embedded in a platform that makes it easy for all the actors to participate, easy for farmers to either verify their data or provide additional data. That's through the software platform itself, the MRV, or Measurement, Reporting, and Verification platform, that enables data collection to be streamlined, enables data collection to be consistent across different fields and different geographies, so that the financing that's supporting that transition to climate smart and resilient production systems can have a synoptic view of progress in terms of the objectives of their program. And so these tools are critical for streamlining the process, as I mentioned, in terms of data collection, transparency for the project developers, but also transparency to the market and the verifiers that are out there saying, yes, these farmers did indeed change their practices, implement the practices that they're being supported to do, and these are what the outcomes are in terms of that whole process. So it's critical as an integrating platform to really bring these technologies to scale. Now, I will say, as we get into smaller production systems, it's complicated, and we'll talk a little bit about that through a couple of project examples. If we go to the next slide, I think from a buyer's perspective or investor's perspective, they want to understand that these assets that are being generated, are they consistent with the standards? Because if there's consistency across standards, then we know we have fungibility in that market. That will unlock additional investment, that will reduce concerns about greenwashing, and will enhance comparability across one project or the other. So there's a series of global standards that are setting the sort of the rules of the road, if you will, the protocols on how we do the quantification, how we verify the outcomes, how we actually capture and account for uncertainty, because agriculture is complex. This is a hard problem to solve. But if we have transparency on what we know and the uncertainty, we feel there's a fungible market that can scale. So all of these rules that the standards developed can be implemented in an MRV platform to streamline the process. So that's a high-level overview of what's the role of MRV and why it's critical for getting to scale, especially as we look at agricultural systems that are spread out over large landscapes, and including smallholder production systems. I'm going to hand it back off to Janet to talk about some examples of public-private partnerships that have utilized these technologies to achieve a set of outcomes. And then I'll talk a little bit at the end about some work we're doing on rice and smallholder production systems in Vietnam. So with that, I'll hand it back to you, Janet.
Of course, I was muted. Thanks, Bill. We at Regrow see really working with nonprofits and the public sector as key to what we do, and really vital for having impact and helping us achieve our mission. So we have a large number of partners in both in the US, which is where kind of we started out a lot of our work. We've worked very closely with EPA, developing partnerships with USDA and groups like the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research to make sure that we are, first off, accurately quantifying emissions. So both getting, ground truth data from our partners to making sure that we, are able to best calibrate our own models. And then also making sure that our data is getting into hands of groups out there so that they can best plan where they want to implement projects and intervene to best support local, farmers. So being able to identify things like where has adoption of some of these climate smart practices been really slow. We're able to do that with our tools and mapping, and then we can provide that data to these partners so that they can identify where would their focuses best have an impact. also, our data is being used by our partners to assess and kind of compare adoption rates of these practices, to also identify areas of interest, be able to do research on things like where with policies that have, for example, really helped support cover cropping, what is the long-term impact of those practices and those policies? Is it actually helping to support farmers in the long term? Also, our data is used for things like baseline metrics for reports and project design documents. And then also there's a lot of research and development projects on things like water quality, these economic outcomes of these practices, and edge of field as well. So I'll give you an example of one of these projects. Once again, this is really focused on the US because this is where a lot of our work has initially been. But as we have and are expanding globally, we're definitely seeing this as kind of a model of something that worked well in the US and hoping to develop more partnerships to be able to do this at a much broader scale. So this is a project that's been going on for several years. It's wrapping up at the end of this year. That is done in partnership with the Nature Conservancy, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, our funding partner, and then also CTIC, the Conservation Technology Information Center. And with these partners, we have been able to both improve a lot of our metrics on our cropland data sets, and also to create a data set around monitoring the productivity and health of grasslands. So being able to identify where grasslands are very vulnerable, and the health and the vegetation of the grassland is decreasing, and then also identifying things like mitigation for soil carbon loss, and what this impact might have broadly. So we have these now data sets that show the perennial forbs and grasslands, shrubbery, bare ground, and then also being able to see the perennial and annual herbaceousness in rangeland production. Because this is really produced in partnership with public partners, there's also definitely a devotion to making sure that this is a publicly available data set. So it's available on CTIC's website, along with data on our cropland data set for all of the US. You can go on there and see what the percentage of cover crops are in, believe it's broken out into Huck 8s, which is larger watersheds. And then you can also see data on tillage practices as well. So this data set, for example, is used by a lot of both nonprofits, Nature Conservancy actors, and also a lot of state agencies are starting to use this data set and have a lot of interest in it in the US, as they are starting to really try and understand what's happening across their state and where they should be targeting their projects. So one other example that's a little bit more relevant for the smallholder farmer space is a project that we have in partnership with 1 Acre Fund, the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, NASA Harvest, and is funded by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. This project that we've called Niche is looking at a G by E by M, which means genotype, environmental inputs, and management inputs, to looking at these 3 factors to best identify which seeds and seed variety for maize specifically is most suitable for specific for specific locations, to make sure that there is the maximum yield potential. So we've this project has focused in Kenya and Rwanda, and is looking, so collecting lots of ground truth data to be able to run this model to identify the best seed varieties and genotype selection that can then be used by 1 acre funds kind of on the ground, field agents who are out there selling seeds directly to farmers so that they know which is the best seed variety in a specific region, depending upon the altitude and what has happened historically in terms of the weather and the soil with that area. They can confidently make a recommendation for which seed that producer should purchase and should grow. So this is an ongoing project that we're working on, and we're also really interested in this yield resilience space, making sure that there's yield stability and there's an increase of yield in a lot of these areas, especially as there's just an increasing demand for maize. That's a key, piece of people's diet and every day. So doing more research on yield, and always interested in more partners that are interested in that with us. So with that, I'll pass it over to Bill to talk about one of our projects, a few of our projects that have happened in Vietnam.
Thank you, Janet. So one project where we were able to demonstrate the role of an MRV to unlock climate finance is a project that was funded by the Ag Results program. Ag Results is a multilateral initiative that's looking at rethinking about international development investments, moving away from what was called push mechanisms to more pull mechanisms, where you create a pay for results prize mechanism to unlock and enable innovation locally to address a barrier. So in this case, this was focused on smallholder rice production in the Red River Delta of Vietnam, where they were looking for incentivizing and trying to innovate changes in agronomic practices that would do the combination: reduce greenhouse gas emissions, enhance crop yields, and do so in a way that enhanced and improved farmer income. And so it was a pay-for-performance program. The Ag Results program is funded by USAID, UK, Canada, Australia, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I believe. And they had different pilot projects globally to try to demonstrate this pull mechanism to get over certain barriers that are impacting global agriculture. So for this project, we were able to use this MRV platform construct that we outlined to engage with 25,000 smallholder farmers in Hai Binh province, which is in the Red River Delta. And we were able to demonstrate that they could simultaneously increase yields, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and actually enhance farmer incomes to a way that is sort of achieves the objectives, right? Creating a more sustainable production system, lower carbon agriculture at scale, and improving smallholder livelihoods. So we learned a lot from that project on how we monitor and estimate outcomes for smallholder farmers. So we worked with 25,000 smallholder farmers in the Red River Delta. So I think it demonstrated that these MRV technologies are really valuable for unlocking different forms of climate finance. As a follow-on to that project, if we go to the next slide, DFAT in Australia wanted to replicate that work that we did in the Red River Delta in the Mekong Delta, but to do it in a slightly different context. This program is focusing primarily on the greenhouse gas outcomes. So they're implementing prize mechanisms for farmers that can reduce greenhouse gas emissions from the Mekong Delta, but are being very flexible in terms of where those carbon assets go. So the government of Vietnam, for example, has a 1 million hectare commitment to low carbon rice in the Mekong Delta. They're working with the international donor community to help co-finance that transition to low emissions production of rice in the Mekong Delta as part of their nationally determined consequences or their NDC commitments. There's also corporate actors in the Mekong that are buying rice production, and they have their own corporate commitments and want to reduce emissions from their supply chain through the insetting pathway. Lastly, there's also carbon demand from the offset community for low carbon emission reductions from rice production systems. So the MRV platform and the data and the technologies were designed to support all three of those potential pathways that are different financing opportunities to unlock smallholder production system. That project is just starting in 2024. We're in the midst of our first growing season. We'll continue for 5 more growing seasons and demonstrate how these MRV technologies can simultaneously support different financing mechanisms for smallholder production system. We're targeting to engage with 200,000 smallholder producers in the region. If we go to the last slide, I think I can go through this pretty quickly, but the point is for these programs, one needs to develop the tools that are agronomically sound and specific to the local production practices. So the government of Vietnam has made some commitments around how low carbon rice should be produced in the Mekong Delta. It has to do with a combination of how one manages their fertilizer to address nitrous oxide emissions, how one manages residue management post-harvest, how you select seed varieties, high quality seed varieties, and how you plant rice to enhance yields while also reducing methane emissions. And then lastly, how you can manage water in such a way that you can use less water resources, conserve water resources, but also address climate issues with significant methane emission reductions. And that's through a commonly known practice as alternative wetting and drying, where you're going from a continuously flooded system to one that's flooded up, allowed to drain, flooded up, allowed to drain, and that reduces methane emissions. And research has shown that it can be a significant way of reducing methane emissions, 45 to up to 70%, depending on the production system. But I will also note that when you do that, with alternative wetting and drying, you also need to be able to understand its impact on other greenhouse gases, namely nitrous oxide. And so nitrous oxide is often produced as you go from a wet to a drier environment. So as you go through these drying cycles, you can create the optimal conditions for N2O production. So that would be a negative climate outcome, but also you'd be losing that nitrogen, which then could affect yields. So you have to have tools and methodologies that capture these interactions between management practices and objectives in terms of climate mitigation and yield objectives. So I think, again, this TRVC project funded by DFAT will be another great example of how all the technologies that we've summarized in this webinar can help unlock climate finance and reach large numbers of smallholder producers in a region, in this case, the Mekong Delta, and achieve climate and yield stability goals and increases in farmer incomes and livelihoods. So it's clear that these technologies can be used for this, but it's only done through the right partnerships. In this TRVC project in the Mekong, there's several public and private sector partners that are critical to that whole process, and hence the theme of this ICT conference is about those kinds of partnerships to engage with smallholder production systems. So if we go to the last slide, Janet, I think we outlined some technologies. We're very excited, committed to try to figuring out how these technologies can support our mission, which is to support climate smart ag, address climate adaptation requirements and food securities. But this can only be done through formal collaborative partnerships. We need partners on the ground, we need partners on the science, we need partners on the policy, we need partners from the private sector that are willing to provide climate finance to achieve the outcomes of these programs. So that's the sort of a high-level overview of our view on technologies and innovative finance, and we have some time for questions.
So feel free to put questions in the chat if anyone has them.
I'll just also note, I mean, Janet and I provided our emails here on this slide. You know, if you have any questions that come to mind as you digest this material, please feel free to send us some emails. And Lindsay, I don't know if there's also a more another fora through your program in terms of, you know, follow-up discussions on topics that were presented the last few days.
Great, I'm putting our emails in the chat now. Great, I see a question on PPP collaboration opportunities in Nigeria. Right now, we have a lot of our work has really been focused on some R&D efforts in East Africa. We are definitely interested in some projects and work in West Africa. I've been exploring some potential opportunities in Ghana. I don't know about Nigeria yet, although because of the similarity potentially in climate zones, and it might be an easier move to potentially do work there as well. You know, we're really kind of focused a lot of our work on rice in these kind of smallholder farmer contexts because of our previous experiences and you know, projects on rice with smallholder farmers in Vietnam. But you know, always, you know, as we aren't yet working there, you know, it's good to keep in touch and see what opportunities come up.
Yeah, and maybe Janet, if I may just add to that,
Yeah.
we do have one corporate partner that is sourcing rice from Nigeria and is interested in exploring a public-private partnership. So it's key to get, you know, partners on the ground that are interested in understanding how potential climate finance can help support smallholder production in Nigeria. In this particular case, from the rice value chain, as that becomes a larger and larger focus of the production systems in Nigeria. So we'd be happy to sort of coordinate a way of connecting the corporate side with other interests on public-private partnerships in Nigeria.
Great. Looking forward to connecting. So another question, thank you. In the industry, is there any attention to the idea that a smallholder's field and management might be their intellectual property, and they might deserve some say in how it is appropriated and used by remote sensing platforms and companies? Bill, do you want to start us with that?
Yes. So I mean, it's clear that remote sensing can get, you know, actionable information on any field globally. So that's an issue that agriculture is beginning to try to come to terms with. All of the programs where we're engaging with corporate actors that are financing practice changes, all of the grower involvement is an opt-in process. So it's up to the grower to decide that they want to participate and share, quote, their field data and their management data, if you will, with those programs in lieu of, or with the idea of getting actually monetization of their data. So that is critical. All of these are optional programs, and the growers get to opt in. then share their data to be part of the programs and receive the monetary benefits. These programs really only work if we're successful in getting value to the growers, right? And value from them to share their data to do so.
I don't know if there's any other questions from the audience. Thank you for joining us. I think with that, we can maybe wrap up. Appreciate everyone joining, and hopefully we can connect with a lot of you soon.
Thank you.